Welcome to SEC Football Live. Of course, I'm Braden Gall. That is Bill Connelly of ESPN, brought to you by ML Rose, 6 great locations in Middle Tennessee. Bill, I know you've been in town, and we've had dinner before in town, but not at an ML Rose. So next time you're in town, we're going to ML Rose.
I'm in. There's a lot. There are so many good places. Anytime I come to Nashville, my restaurant list is like 38 long, but we'll make sure that happens.
Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, ML Rose, all 6 locations. No, make sure you check that out. So, of course, I wanted to talk with you about your returning production and your SP Plus rankings. All of that out, of course, on ESPN, ESPN.com. Make sure you go check that out. But you're sort of in the preseason prognostication world, sort of like we are at Athlon Sports. For those that are listening, of course, I've been with the company for like 18 years now, and we're working on putting the magazine together, and we have some conflicts around how to decide what a returning starter actually is. So we're going to get into the process here in terms of what you evaluate, what you think in terms of how to decide returning starters, and then how you guys get into sort of the calculation of S&P Plus, and then we'll talk about some teams, if that sounds okay to you, BC.
That works.
Great. All right, so let me ask you our question first because I'm selfish. Carson Beck, as an example, like Athlon Sports has a returning starter metric, right? We have, it used to be there'd be 18 returning starters. Now, like if you get to 9 or 10, it's like a big deal. But I'm curious how you evaluate transfers that have tons of experience. Carson Beck is a particular one, but they're all over the place. He has a ton of starting experience. He is not technically a returning starter for Miami, but he is a returning starter. So how do you evaluate? And I'm not talking about the traditional transfer where a guy was a backup, didn't play a lot. Right. We don't know exactly what he's going to be, goes to a new team. When you look at the SEC or anybody in college football, how do you apply a guy who has tons of experience and has experience at that position, but not on that team? How do you parse that out?
Yeah, I don't think there's no such thing as a traditional transfer anymore. I'm pretty sure it's all shapes and sizes. But yeah, I mean, if you're listening in that way, you almost need like a returning starters and incoming starters kind of measure, because it really is 2 completely different things. The way I have always done returning production, and I still do it this way. I'm going to fiddle with different approaches here in the offseason, or at least I tend to. I never get to everything on my list, but I do want to play with that idea of returning versus incoming. What I've always done with my returning production metric is simply, if you go to a new school, your last year's production comes with you. So in the example of Miami, they lost Cam Ward's 4,313 passing yards, but they return in both the numerator and the denominator Carson Beck's 3,485 passing yards. So therefore, overall, they return about 50% of their passing yards for the season, and that's the way I did it when the national average for transfers per team was like 2. And it was a lot when you had like 6. And I still do it that way because it still kind of seems to work a little bit. Like how much I weight different things has changed through the years, but it still gets at what I want to get at. But no, it's if we're just talking about a number, it was interesting when I was writing about returning production and some of the early off-season pieces I've had here. I've noticed things like, they return players who were responsible for this many starts last year, but they also are bringing in players who had this many starts in FBS. And, for defense, they return like 11 and 15 guys with 200 plus snaps, but then also blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So it has definitely, the nomenclature has changed in 2025.
Is there like a new school tax or maybe like reducer? Because like if you bring in, and we could look everywhere in the SEC, for example. I mean, look at all the players that Ole Miss and A&M and like Texas, like everybody's got them. If you look at a player with 1,000 yards rushing, let's just say, I'm going to use rushing yards because it's easy. If you have 1,000 yards rushing and you transfer schools, it's almost like you go to a new system, a new coaching staff, a new city. There's also this human side of all of this experience. So it's not like you're getting 1,000 yards of production. Right. There's a chance that player might be better in your system, but there's also a chance that they have to make all these adjustments. So is it almost like you should get like 80% of the returning value? Is that like, I mean, you're the stats guy. I'm just like a random dude like throwing out percentages here.
Well, that's exactly, I mean, I do want to play with that a little bit for that exact reason, on average, because I mean, every transfer is different, but on average, yeah. Like, is it 1 for 1? Is it whatever? For FCS and D2 guys, FCS and below, I do only count half. But yeah, maybe there is something, if it's that translation from like G5 to power conference. I don't know what that is for sure. We've seen so many success stories and so many very much not success stories that I don't know where the average is, but that is something I would like to find out.
So if you're if you run for 1,000 yards at Tennessee and then you transfer to Western Kentucky, does it count as 1,200 yards?
Oh, right. That would be interesting. I don't know why you're transferring if you just rush for 1,000 yards at Tennessee, but we'll see. We'll see. That's the goal.
Perhaps if you have a great season at Ole Miss and you want to go to Ohio State, one can guess what might be motivating you to go to Ohio
just
State.
Maybe.
All right, you put in your article, you have 3 major questions. What are those 3 questions when you sit down and decide both S&P and returning production?
Yeah, so for the SP Plus projections as a whole, it is basically what percentage of last year's production, whether it's yours or somebody else's, do you return? How have you recruited recently? That piece has changed dramatically in the last few years. And then just kind of what I always call a program health measure, where it's just basically recent history. It's sort of a weighted look at like it's been 5 years. One thing that's definitely changed is it's more like 4 years, kind of 3 years now. But just a recent history piece to kind of if you're a 1-year wonder or you've been good more frequently, it kind of gets at that. So biggest piece by far is basically how good were you last year and what do you return? But then there are all these other factors involved to try to, account for the rest.
How over the years you've been doing this, how accurate do you think returning production has been for you at predicting the upcoming season?
Yeah, it's always been. I always have to make sure, like when people see their team high on the list, doesn't mean you're going to be good. It just probably means you're going to improve or regress. That's really what it's correlated with. It's again, we're talking about humans and weird situations, and there are always exceptions. On average, typically, if you get to that 70% mark in returning production, that probably means you're looking good for this coming season in terms of improvement. If you're above 80%, you're quite likely to improve. But Oklahoma State was at like 85% last year. And so every situation is still different. There's no guarantee here at all. But looking at the outliers especially usually tells you something. You might get Oklahoma State wrong, but you'll also see Iowa State coming, for instance, like they improved last year. So that's the kind of situation we're looking at there. Air Force last year had horrible return and production numbers and fell apart.
Well,
and so
they don't count.
Yeah, well, I will say too, I think the negative returning production figures are probably a little bit more predictive than the positive ones too. So the ones at the bottom, sorry, Northern Illinois, you're probably not going to have a lot of fun this year.
So there are 2 teams in the SEC above 70%, 3 teams below 50%. So we'll get to those in just a second. But over time, how different? And I don't think it's even over time. I think it's recently we've seen would you call it like plummeting amount of returning production for teams across the sport writ large?
Yeah, it's been really fun tracking that through the years. So going back to 2014, we were at 63% returning production that year. That was the first year I put all this together
for the whole sport,
for the national average. And over the coming years, it barely moved. It's 62.3, 63.3. I'm looking at a spreadsheet here while being filmed. That's always good TV. 62.4. It's all podcast. For 5 straight years, it was basically between about 62 and 64. It was real stable. 2019, it dropped down to 61, which was, didn't matter. 2020, it was back to 63 in advance of the season that only sort of happened. But since then, it's told the story. In 2021, it was at 77% national average because, everybody returned. Everybody got a bonus year. You only left if you wanted to, basically. And so 2021 was loaded. Then it comes back down to 63% in 2022. And that's when transfers picked up as well. Then it's at 60% in 23. Then it's at 59.9% in 24. This year so far, it's at 53.7%. A humongous drop, biggest drop other than the weird 21 situation. So, number one, anybody left who had a bonus year of eligibility, they're just about done now. So I think that's part of it, especially like if you were a true freshman in 20 and then you redshirted in 21, maybe you still have another year, but there aren't a ton of those guys. And then the other thing I think is just that we have so many transfers now. We've already topped last year's national average in terms of just raw. It's at like 14 transfers per team this year.
Is that the actual for all 136? That's the average?
Think so, yeah. Or it was like 3 weeks ago, the last time I looked. And when you have that, the way I just described the process for losing Cam Ward but bringing in Carson Beck. Now you think about like Miami gets the quarterback, but still only returns 50% of their yards. Georgia loses the quarterback and now returns 3% of their yards or whatever. So every time a player transfers who was actually productive, like that overall number goes down on average. Just it's the way that works. So I think those two things are kind of wreaking havoc right now. And it definitely bears mentioning that, the Big 12 and SEC are at about 59, 60%. ACC is at 59, Big 10's at 56. And then the G5 is at 54 for Conference USA, all the way down to 44 for the MAC. The G5 I've been using the word fleeced here. The G5 has been fleeced this year in terms of losing stars to the upper levels of the sport.
Fleeced feels like you agreed to a deal that you got.
Right.
I don't think they agreed to the deal.
I don't know how much they agreed to it, but it was a deal, and it turned out that they didn't get the good side of it. That's for sure.
But they still have one bid in the playoff, Bill. That's all that matters. They still get that one. Still get that one bid.
It is literally something. Yes, they're not going to get any of the playoff money. That's all going to the teams that already had all the money, but they literally get a bid.
Well, maybe when they take away the 3 and the 4 seed from the Group of 5 champion, they'll just give them that $4 million for being a conference title winner. All right. So I want to start with the teams broadly here, and then a couple of other teams in the SEC that I'm going to dive into, which is A&M number 1 in the conference in terms of returning production, 71%. Vanderbilt number 2 at 70%. They're number 6 and number 8 nationally on your list. So I'm curious, what you are saying is the biggest correlation for fans to understand about returning production is general improvement, progression, and general regression. So A&M and Vandy, what's interesting about Vanderbilt is, you have them fairly low, I think second to last in the SP+, but they are above 70% or 70% or better. A&M was also, if I recall, wasn't A&M extremely high last year on the returning production metrics as well? And changing coach, I get all of that. Are you telling us that A&M and Vanderbilt have the best chance to show progression in 2025 based on these metrics?
Yeah, I do think A&M was pretty high last year as well. That's hard to pull off, actually, but they did improve a little bit. It's for whatever it's worth. The win total only improved by 1, but they did go from 16th to 13th in SP Plus as well. I mean, they really are a case of just that middle-class SEC team that is clearly talented, but never as good as the best SEC teams and always ends up with the same record. But so they're in pretty good shape, and a lot of it's their own production. Defensive line obviously needed a severe upgrade for A&M. Receiving core got a massive not upgrade, but just a turnover. Lots of outgoing, lots of incoming. But you return your quarterback. You return the entire offensive line, I believe, or at least the starting offensive line. Secondary was really young on returns, almost in full. So I do feel pretty good about A&M. I still can't decide. I can't decide what the ceiling is for that team. I can't decide what Marcel Reed's ceiling is. And that's obviously going to determine a lot of this. But I love Kevin Concepcion, the guy they got from NC State, or I loved him 2 years ago. He didn't do much last year because team just stunk last year, but it was really fun in 2023. So that was a good move, and good run game, more dangerous receiving core. We'll see. Defense. I don't think the defense was up to Elko's standards last year, since if I recall correctly, he's taken over play calling duties. Is that what I heard?
Yeah.
But so, we'll see about that, but offense should improve, I think.
What's fascinating is I was talking to Shamar Stewart and the other folks at the Combine, and a lot of them were saying, look, we were supposed to just do our jobs. And there's some folks that took that to say, not making excuses for the other players on the defense. That's not what their intent was. But it was sort of just like, well, either the scheme was wrong or you guys are not sort of playing the role correctly. And it's funny to hear now that there's some Elko taking a little bit more taking a little bit more control over that side of the ball, which should be interesting to keep an eye on. Vanderbilt, 68% offense, but 73% on defense, which, of course, with Diego Pavia coming back and a Clark Lee defense, this is already the best season maybe in Vanderbilt history. You think they can replicate that?
It all comes down to the offensive line. Obviously the numbers are good. The defense, 4 transfers coming in, but most of last year's starters are back. And like I was just saying with A&M, the secondary was young and now returns a lot. So that all looks pretty good. they improved. Like they were still only 59th in defense last year in SP plus, but that was a year after ranking 124th. So that's not bad. Pretty good, pretty decent improvement there. Very, very bend don't breakish, which I think is harder to replicate success from year to year. Not good like success rate type numbers. But yeah, I think they have a very good chance to improve defensively. Offensively, Pavia, it's great having him back. The receiving core, 3 of the top 4 targets are back. That offensive line is full makeover, and it'll just come down to like the Jordan White kid from Liberty, All Conference USA. Not great size, but pretty good. But then kid from Texas Tech, kid from Oklahoma State, kid from Virginia Tech, kind of looks like they're all going to need to do something and contribute because Pavia already runs a lot. If you're making him run even more and getting him hit more, that's probably not going to work out very well for you.
They run a glorified triple option, which is cool. I'm cool with that. I want to ask you about Oklahoma. This is a fascinating team, which is number 3 in the SEC in returning production, 69%. Nice. Number 10 in America, but number 1 in the offensive world. And this goes right back to our previous conversation because Jackson Arnold is gone. They bring in John Mateer, Ben Arbuckle, one of the youngest coordinators, if not the youngest in all of college football. Brent Venables, of course, the defensive coach, only 46th in the country in returning production in terms of the defensive side of the ball. The line of scrimmage is a question for this team. This is a critical year for Brent Venables. You know, they hired Jim Nagy as the general manager. They had this whole I like that he's going with a total package overhaul on offense. Mateer is a very fun player to watch. Does it work in the SEC against those defensive fronts? We'll see. It's going to be fun to find out. But this is a fascinating team that I can't get a hold of. If things go right, it is a team that could absolutely be a top 15 team or a top 20 team. But they haven't gone right so far with Venables and Norman.
Yeah, it's always been something. The offense was fine under Venables, but the defense was really slow to improve. Now, then the defense, I think, was their best since 2013 last year, and their offense was its worst since the 1990s. So it is that whole thing where it's just like bailing sand. Like you pick some up, and then half of it falls out of your hands, and you gotta. Program building's hard for a reason, but. I talked about Vandy's offensive line makeover. I thought we were going to see more of a makeover from Oklahoma because theirs was just so atrocious last year. And part of that was experience. They had a couple freshmen in the rotation, but it wasn't all experience. These were like juniors getting lit up too. Yeah. And so the fact that they bring a lot of guys back up front, they did bring in a kid from Stanford, kid from Western Carolina as well. You know, we'll see. But I expected more. Brought in a ton of wide receivers, which was obviously also a problem. But the offensive line was just like the Oklahoma offensive line was one of the most reliable units in the country in anything in the 2000s. It was horrible last year. So that's going to tell the tale here. It's same as with Pavia. John Mateer is great, but if he's running around too much and taking a lot of hits, you know, that's just not going to work out well. So definitely good spot for a makeover. I certainly like some of the guys they brought in through the portal, but it's just going to come down to that offensive line, I think.
I mean, 78% returning production on offense. Like it feels like they are set up to and this is kind of a weird way to say it, but it's more of like a media view of this team. They are set up for us to finally get maybe an accurate portrayal of the Venables Oklahoma version is what it feels like. Is that fair?
Yeah, and they're going to do it against the hardest schedule in the country.
It's bad.
You know, using SP Plus projections, they play 13 Michigan in week 2, then 23 Auburn in week 4, and then their last 7 games are against numbers 7, 16, 9, 8, 2, 15, and 10. So if they're not a top 15 team, that's a problem.
Sounds like a Florida Gators schedule. Is what it
right,
sounds
exactly. Like. I think they're like 1/100th of a decimal point ahead of Florida in the SOS factor. That I just calculated. So.
You have Florida at number 10 in the conference in the S&P Plus, and you have Oklahoma at 11, but 17th and 20th in the country. Yeah. It's like a recruiting ranking list right now.
Right, pretty much. That's how I always get yelled at because they know I take recruiting rankings into account. Therefore, I'm always overrating the SEC. But I mean.
They put more players into the draft than everybody else.
Yeah, and also recruiting is it's not a humongous part of that formula either. But anyway.
See, imagine that nuance and context, BC. I want to ask you about Missouri because according to your numbers, they are one of the strangest looking teams returning from all of last year, 100th in all of college football, and one of the worst in the SEC in terms of returning production on offense, 44%. But number 1 in the conference on defense at 76%. Very different from this time last year. where they bring back Cook, they bring back Burden, they bring back a bunch of pieces, and they had to replace NFL corners, NFL linebacker, NFL pass rusher. Totally different scenario. I didn't think they could replicate the season from 2 years ago last year. I thought those expectations were unfair. The schedule certainly sets up last year and this year. Is there anything about this team in particular that now that it's inverted and that they're bringing so much back on defense that might allow Eli Drinkowitz to sort of stabilize things? Again, he's done a very good job. No criticism here from him. But what does the makeup of this team tell you about the trajectory of the program?
Yeah, I mean, and typically this is the way it works. If you have a ton of returning production on one side of the ball, that probably means you got a bunch of seniors who are about to leave, and then you kind of go to the other end of but the portal has made that more of a kind of a nebulous thing. You can try to account for that. It definitely seems like with Drinkwitz, he tries to basically bring in however many starters he lost. Like lost our starting running back, bring in Ahmad Hardy. Brought in a new slot man to replace Luther Burton, brought in a new tight end, although he didn't lose Brett Norfleet, I guess. Lost 3 offensive line starters, brought in 3 offensive linemen, etc. Defense, he's kind of loaded up a little bit. Like they brought in more transfers than they lost starter-wise, and that should work pretty well as long as they've got, I think they have the pass rushers. I'm not completely sure about the cornerback situation. Didn't love necessarily what he brought in there, but we'll see. Linebackers should be good. I think basically, obviously I live in Columbia, Missouri. I have a lot of opinions on Missouri as a whole. It really comes down to, I hate saying everything comes down to the quarterback. Kind of feels like everything comes down to the quarterback here. They should run the ball well. The receiving corps should actually still be pretty good considering they lost both Burden and Theo Weiss, but they brought back the underclassmen who were pretty good. Kevin Coleman from Mississippi State, a lot to like there. But is Bo Prabula good? Yes, no. That's pretty much the season for Missouri.
Pass fail, Eli.
Right. And that's
what it is.
That's why Prabula got in the portal when he did, because he wanted to make sure he got a decent landing spot. And Drinkwitz, I think, who else did he go after? Miller Moss, I think. Yeah. I think I'd take a risk on Prabula's upside instead, but I'm not completely sure.
Why does Bo Prabula sound like a body part, like a ligament? It sounds like a muscle.
And I don't, is it Bula or like Beulah? I think I've heard it both ways. I don't know which one's right. So
we'll find out. We got a long time to go.
That's right.
South Carolina is fascinating to me. This is a team, one of the hottest teams in the country at the end of the year, surging into the playoff rankings, outside conversations about whether or not they belong or not. I don't think they did, having lost to the 2 teams ahead of them.
Yeah, that was tough.
Hard to overcome. But they bring back a lot of key pieces. They do not bring back a lot of overall pieces. In fact, when I was at the Combine, there's a safety in Emin Worry and, of course, Sanders and all these guys, Kennard. Yeah. He's got a lot of talent off the defense, but they still have a ton of 5 stars that Shane Beamer has recruited. So you've got them at 13th in the SEC in terms of returning production, 56%. Offense a little bit more than defense, of course. 71st in the nation, and you've got them 9th in the conference in S&P. So is there a disconnect between what we saw at the end of the year and them trying to replicate that based on the metrics that you're using?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Shane Beamer has kind of mastered the art of like sticking the landing. They kind of waft through a given season looking good and bad and good and bad and good and bad, and then they do something really impressive at the end. And that's kind of what they did this year too, obviously. I mean, they got smoked by Ole Miss, looked pretty poor a few different times. And then suddenly they were awesome. The defense was awesome most of the year. That was obviously where most of the improvement came from. They jumped from 55th to 13th in defensive SP+. And, that makes it kind of alarming then that they returned Dylan Stewart, and he's clearly going to be pretty incredible. But otherwise, your top 3 defensive linemen besides him are gone. Like every linebacker is gone, half your starting secondary. He didn't go in and bring like definite slam dunks in the portal on that side of the ball. Brought in some like younger guys who might be awesome, but we don't know. So yeah, like how far the defense falls is going to be kind of the number one question here, because it almost certainly will, and then the offense will have to make up for that. Sellers not being a redshirt freshman anymore, that'll certainly help. But he was super inconsistent last year. His best plays were absolutely hypnotic, but sack rates, he scrambled into pressure a ton. It really was kind of all or nothing for him, and it was all or nothing for the offense too.
I felt like he got faster as the season went along, which is a very very strange thing to say. Like you're a 4.8 guy in week 1, and you're like a 4.5 guy in the final week against Clemson. Anyway, Texas, Georgia, Ole Miss, your final 3 names. in terms of returning production, all outside of the top 100,
Yeah.
all below 50%. Texas and Georgia recruited a very different level than Ole Miss. Maybe not very, but certainly a different level than Ole Miss. I'm just not as worried. You've got Georgia and Texas as two of the top 3 teams in S&P Plus in this conference. We know what they are with the coaching staff and the talent and the recruiting base, et cetera. To your point, health of the program, very healthy for both of them.
Yeah.
But is Ole Miss dead last in the conference in returning production? Are they the one to be most concerned about?
Well, it definitely means that the transfer class is going to have to hit again. And I mean, he's committed to this. He loses a bunch of guys every year and goes and loads up on transfers again. I don't think he's taken quite as many this year as normal. Maybe that'll change with the spring. And also, I don't love what he did this year or the names that he's brought in. There are some guys I'm pretty sure are going to hit. Jaden Yates, the linebacker from Marshall, really good run defender, should fit right in. Pretty athletic, not huge, but pretty athletic at the very least. The receiving corps, he brought in a bunch of guys from disappointing offenses. Deshaun Stribling from Oklahoma State, Harrison Wallace III from Penn State, who the main thing people remember from Penn State was a receiver didn't catch a pass in the semifinals against Notre Dame. He was the leading wide receiver for that group. So kind of taking some more risks than normal here this year. And, I guess he's going to really hope that Austin Simmons clicks a quarterback. And the fact that he didn't go out and swing big at some huge name, maybe that means he's really confident. But if I don't think there are as many guarantees with this team. And talking about recent history, they were second in SP Plus last year. Like their upside, even with the 3 losses, the upside they showed when they looked good was higher than anybody else's in the country besides Ohio State. They were dynamite for about 3/4 of the season. They had a couple unlucky losses, really missed an opportunity. If they'd crept into the playoff, they really could have done some damage. And I don't think I see it. I see a kind of a setback this year.
Well, and you could I'm just trying to think through. You've got 3 defensive linemen, a corner, a receiver, and a former running back that all could be top 75 picks in the draft. I know Judkins doesn't count, but he was there. In your opinion, based on all this stuff, you look at returning production, you look at the S&P, you look at the metrics, and then you put on sort of your gut instinct hat as well. Who's the most improved team in this conference? If you had to give me 1 or 2 names, there's a lot of buzz for Auburn, a lot of buzz for Florida. Tennessee's taking a step back probably. Who are the names that you think show the most improvement that maybe we haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah, I mean, it also kind of depends on, improved over, is A&M kind of a candidate for most improved, or were they already pretty good? I don't know where to draw that line exactly, but I will say, especially if we boil it down to Auburn versus Florida has, I'm much more confident in their quarterback situation. So I'm going to go with Florida. And it's funny I say that, their defense was the reason they improved last year. Really underrated defense as a whole, and it returns quite a bit of it too. So that all looks really good. But having Lagway, his numbers were just better than Graham Mertz, even though the defense carried a lot of weight. I really like what I see there on that side of the ball. So I'm gonna say them. Auburn is super interesting to me this year because so much of SP Plus comes down to efficiency and explosiveness. Efficiency, I use that success rate measure that I've talked about a bunch through the years. They were quite a bit more efficient than their opponents. They were more explosive than their opponents. They made more big plays. But they were so consistently reliable in committing turnovers, not forcing turnovers, and imploding in the red zone. They did it almost every game. That despite getting the 2 biggest things in the sport right, they were 34th overall, and they were 5-7, and they almost scored some good wins, but they reliably made the plays they couldn't make. And what that means, in theory, that doesn't have to be a sustainable thing, new quarterback and so on and so forth. I just need to see it. The receiving court's got to be awesome, but they have a couple of disappointing quarterbacks they're hoping they can turn around. The running back's going to be new. Jarquez Hunter was the most reliable thing on that entire team, and he's gone. Yeah. So I just need to see the pieces working. It's absolutely possible, but I trust Florida more.
So Bama loses Milroe. They lose Saban last year. They're going to lose they got a lot of really talented freshmen off last year's team that are back, of course. I think the offensive line is going to be really good. But I'm curious. They are 6th in the SEC, 35th in returning production, but number 1 in the conference in SP plus, number 2 in America. What if you're selling Alabama to people? What is the what are you selling to people that makes them, outside of, hey, they still have one of the best rosters in America? How are you selling Alabama this offseason?
Well, I kind of had to sell them to myself, because as soon as the first time I ran SP plus, I'm like, okay, let's see, Ohio State 1, Alabama. Oh, come on. I'm going to get yelled at for SEC bias now. And I had nothing to do with, I mean, I think there's obviously within the numbers, there's still a little bit of a Saban effect, obviously, with not only roster talent, even though clearly the freshmen that the post Saban recruits are fine too. But there's still a little, the recent history piece still has Saban in there. So, maybe that helps them a little bit. But I think the major thing that SP plus sees is, one of the most just recruiting history off the charts before Saban left and after. And they return, outside of Milroe, they return most of the receiving corps. They return a healthy portion of the offensive line. They brought in at least a couple of good transfers, I think. A couple transfers that didn't make any sense to me. I don't know why you'd bring in a guy to be backup left tackle. But so that was kind of strategic in some ways. And the defense should be absolutely dynamite. It was good last year. It wasn't the Saban level best we ever saw from him by any means, but they're 9th in success rate, 10th in explosiveness. And then they return a majority of last year's major contributors. So once again, do they have a quarterback? Yes, no, that'll take it the rest of the way. But if they have a decent B grade quarterback, sure seems like they've got everything else they need to be a good team. And Kalen DeBoer this time last year was probably one of my 2 or 3 favorite head coaches in the country. So
no question. All right, 2 ships passing in the night. I will let you go after this. LSU and Tennessee, it feels like. Tennessee, I think, taking a step back slightly. Yeah. LSU taking a step forward, both returning very, very capable and very talented quarterbacks. Had varying degrees of success last year in critical situations. So number 1 is, which quarterback do you think has the ability to sort of do the super quarterback thing? Both of them whom could be very high draft picks at the end of the year. There's a little bit more pressure on Brian Kelly, no pressure at all on Josh Heupel. It does feel like they are the top of the second tier of this conference, and that someone's going to elevate themselves to that next tier. Obviously, Georgia and Texas are there. You've got Alabama in that tier as well. I'm fine with that. It feels like the 4th team is probably going to come down to one of these 2, maybe a 3rd. And we've talked about Florida and South Carolina, et cetera. But it does feel like these 2 with returning quarterbacks have a good chance. My perspective is LSU will be better and Tennessee will be worse. Do the quarterbacks change that calculus, in your opinion?
Well, I would say I like Nussmeier more than Iamaleava, but Nico also has less pressure because we know his defense is going to be good. That was the story last year. I mean, they were 23rd on offense and 6th on defense. That's how they made the playoff. Defense obviously doesn't return everybody, but it returns a lot. So I think if they have a top 10 defense again, and I think they're projected 4th on defense in SP plus, then that means Iamaleava doesn't have to take some huge leap. And that'll be a very good thing, because I don't maybe he will, but it seemed like he had a pretty big leap to take still. He was pretty inconsistent. Another guy who, turned a lot of pressures into sacks last year. He wasn't quite decisive enough at times. And his receiving core is pretty new this year as well. So that does feel a situation like last year's strengths and weaknesses kind of look like this year's strengths and weaknesses. And I mean, hey, they made the playoff last year, so maybe that works. But yeah, it does feel like LSU is this year's Ole Miss just from a going for it perspective. And you look at, I like Blake Baker. When he's got pieces to be aggressive on the edge, he knows how to use them. And if you tell me right now that Perkins and Weeks are both completely healthy next season, then second-year Baker with those guys and the new Patrick Payton at defensive end, that sounds fantastic. And if they can leap from, where were they last year? 34th on defense. If they get to the top 20, I think the offense can take it from there. So yeah, I'm leaning LSU, but Tennessee's a lot more knowns, I think, at least with the defense.
4 teams in the playoff, maybe? I know it's
that's always, I think that's always going to be, we did this a million times. That's going to be the average. Yeah. So yeah, that's always what you're going to be looking for, which makes it silly that they're trying to mandate it. It's going to work out just fine for them. Just let it play out. You're going to get your 4 teams, maybe 5 usually.
So out of 136 teams returning starters, number 5, Kennesaw State. Number 4, Texas Tech. Number 3, Illinois. You got to go read the article for 1 and 2. I'm not going to give it to you, so go read the article. I think we covered almost every single SEC team, so I do appreciate you being patient with us there. All right, last one for you here. Make sure you check out ML Rose if you're ever in town. Not just you, but all the great folks that are listening and watching to this. Make sure you check out ML Rose. 6 great locations in Middle Tennessee. A 7th coming to my neighborhood. Selfishly, I'm very excited about that. So are my daughters. Great burgers, great beer selection, great drink specials on Saturdays. So if you're watching SEC basketball, make sure you check out those drink specials and those brunch menus at any of those great locations across Middle Tennessee. My wife and I went to London last spring for the first time. And so now I desperately need to decide on an EPL team. However, I've never been, this makes me an old curmudgeon, Bill, but like I believe in sort of legitimate fandom and like illegitimate fandom. Like if you grew up in like Georgia and you're a Duke basketball fan, a Notre Dame football fan, and a Cowboys fan, and a Lakers fan, like I have no respect for you. So it's hard for me to grasp why people are capable of picking an EPL team without having like a family tie or something. Yeah. I've been to London. I've been to the Cotswolds. That's about it. I haven't been to Birmingham, and I haven't been to Manchester, and I have no desire to pick a team for Manchester. So whatever. I'm curious, based on ownership, history, success, what are the things I should value when making a decision on an EPL team?
So you're right. It absolutely has to be organic. This is not you picking a team. It's a team picking you, and you're just trying to make yourself as open as possible to the possibilities. So, I mean, I was lucky. I've been to some matches in England. I've been to a bunch of matches in Germany. Last time I saw our friend Stephen Godfrey, I tried to convince him to pick Schalke in Germany because of their long history of extreme passion and incompetence. It seemed to grab him. So I think
it's very Godfrey. I agree.
That's right. I think we've got something there. But no, I think really if you don't have the opportunity to go to a match, because every place I've been to a match, I'm kind of fond of that team now. Like even if it's not an outright like rooting for a situation, you know where you get the beer beforehand, you know where everything is. It just feels familiar. Yeah. But beyond that, I think you really just have to read the stories. Like whatever game's on, get up in the morning, see the teams, pull up Wikipedia, start fiddling with the history or the colors.
This is what I've done. Song. This is what I'm doing. So I love the fact that I want one of the London teams probably just because it's easy to get there and go to a game and while I'm in London or passing through to another country in Europe as
Makes sense.
My wife and I want to visit. I love Fulham because of all the American. I've read about all the American ties. Of course, you got Robinson there now. Pulisic I watched when he was with Chelsea. They've got a great female a program as well with 2 daughters who play soccer. That's big important to me. But they're owned by the Jaguars owner, right? Khan.
That Fulham is Fulham's owned by the Cons.
So again, I can't find. I understand Tottenham. The only match I've been to was in Tennessee. Of course, it was Man right. City versus Tottenham, which was super fun. Like I sat in the Tottenham section. It was super fun. But it feels like I also don't love the idea of like rooting for the Yankees. Like in general with the big stadiums, I like the charming Wrigley Field, Fenway Park, college football type stadiums, which also doesn't like I don't know what to do here. Like they all conflict. Each of my priorities seems to conflict.
So I just remembered, you guys have Club World Cup team. That's not going to be the same either. But what do you have? You have let's see, Auckland City versus Boca Juniors. No. Leon versus Esperance. Oh, geez. Okay.
Are you going down a tier now? Is that what you're doing?
Well, no, I was looking at the games, the matches that are going to be played in Nashville in the Club World Cup, and never mind. That doesn't help at all.
Here's the thing. I want a team. If I'm picking from scratch, I know it's supposed to be organic, but I do want a team that's like, I don't need to win the EPL. I don't need that, but I do want someone who's relatively competent. And also, hopefully, top 4 to get me into the European tournaments and stuff.
Well, from an ownership perspective, it is Chelsea's hard. Hard to really get into those owners. Arsenal, it all depends on what you think of the Cronkies. Rams, Nuggets, etc. Here in Columbia, Missouri, they think certain things about the Cronkies.
You guys say that's fine.
So, let's see, Spurs, their ownership, not very like any of the huge clubs.
I know.
Probably terrible people that you don't really enjoy all that much. So I personally, of those choices, I would go with Brentford or Fulham because you're going to get a little more quaint, a little more relatable.
There's a lot of momentum for Fulham. A lot of momentum.
You're probably not going to ever watch your team playing in the Champions League. There's no
I know.
They're top 10 right now. not
not close. That's not
Never
close. That's not close. That's like finishing 19th in the college football playoff rankings. Like,
Gotcha.
oh,
But
great
that's a good
season.
bowl. That's a good bowl,
Yeah, exactly. Great season. You're going to get 3 million viewers in the Cheez-It Bowl or whatever.
Yeah.
So, all right, man. Thank you so much for your time. I kept you way too long because I wanted to talk some European soccer, but thank you. Enjoy the off season. Take a deep breath. We got a long way to go, but I do appreciate you. Check out Returning Starters. Everybody listening, make sure you check out Returning Starters. Make sure you check out S&P Plus, and make sure you give them a follow all over all the socials. Very active on Blue Sky these days, so I do appreciate that. Otherwise, Bill C., thanks, man. Do appreciate it.
Yep. Take care.